Wouldn't that be ironic? After all this sacrifice of blood and treasure, all the billions that have been spent on this war, we end up with a bloke still called Khamenei who's running the country, but we end up with Iran more resilient, able to do quite a lot with very little.
There is the potential for a Vietnam-style complete disillusionment of the Americans. Their military may be shown to have been not up to the task, and that new forms of warfare, so-called asymmetric, as indeed the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese practice against them, may, in a sense, humble them.
What's Britain's role in all this?
Hiding behind the sofa.
Hello and welcome to Fourcast Indicators on the Iran war with me, Matt Frei, alongside the defence and intelligence analyst, Mark Urban.
Yes, well, the idea behind Fourcast Indicators is simple. Each episode, we will look out for the signals analysts watch out for most closely. We separate the wheat from the chaff, the signal from the noise, and look for the telltale signs that suggest imminent and significant change may be coming.
Indeed. So Donald Trump says he wants to take the oil and may seize Kharg Island as the US reinforces its troops in the Middle East. Iran remains dangerous even if weakened. Diplomacy still flickers in the background, and hanging over all of it is the biggest strategic question of them all. What happens now to Iran's nuclear program, and what lessons does Tehran draw from all of this? Mark, let's start with the first indicator, the Strait of Hormuz. And everyone keeps saying that they're closed, but they're not entirely closed, are they?
And that, in a sense, is my first indicator, is what I'm looking out for every day now is what is coming through. So I can tell you, before we sat down for this chat, 2 Chinese-registered container ships came through the Strait of Hormuz. And indeed 3...
Travelling in which direction?
Travelling out.
Right.
In other words, they passed through the Iranian checks.
The toll booth.
Yeah. Well, we don't know if they paid, but 3 oil tankers were also due out today. Now, people are talking about a level of 5, 6, 7 ships a day, which is about a tenth of what would be normal. So it's not business as usual. But what is happening, and I think this is why this is such an important indicator, is Iran is staking its claim to control the strait. And we say it's closed, but it isn't. And actually closing it through mining the whole thing could be a further stage of escalation.
I was looking at some intelligence briefings this morning, and the numbers are really quite interesting. So before the war started, Iran was sending something like between 2.4 and 2.8
million barrels
a day of both petrochemical products and oil, through the Strait of Hormuz into the shadow market where people would mostly Chinese people would buy it, or Chinese companies. I think 90% of that oil goes to China. Since, as of last week, we're back at that number. But there's one big difference. The price of that barrel of oil, which was it was a discounted price, of course, because it was sanctioned oil. So I think they were flogging it roughly at about $60 a barrel of Brent crude. And their particular vintage is light crude. I mean, apparently that's the signature crude that the Iranians produce. And now they're selling it for 108. So the discount has gone down massively because people, especially the Chinese, are desperate to get hold of this stuff. And by the way, they're making money. We don't know how much, but they're making money from the tankers that are going through. Now, I don't know what you've heard. I've heard $2 million a tanker. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. It's a flexible pricing, I would have thought.
Yeah, dynamic pricing. And the fascinating thing is, in this day and age, with open source intelligence that people are gathering, we can look at every part of it, and we can know that there are 5 tankers filling up at Kharg Island. That's roughly 2 million barrels, apparently. We can look at all aspects of this, and we can try and work out what are they actually doing with this. Now, it was in the old days the case that the Iranians used to say to people, I had a former British ambassador relay this to me, if you don't let us get our oil out, no one's going to get their oil out. And now, because of this war, the reverse situation has happened.
Exactly.
They're the only people
getting their oil out, exactly.
And as you say, at a premium price. So that's one of the big questions, I think, going forward about the terms on which this ends. Are the Iranians allowed to assert their rights in this way? And even if they're not, everybody will know, the Gulf states and others going forward, that this weapon is there if they want to use it.
And I know that because we spoke to some Gulf officials at the weekend when I was still in Israel, or last week. I mean, they're furious that the Iranians might be able to establish a toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz. But I don't think they're furious enough in order to risk going to war over it. Not yet. I mean, depends who you speak to. I think the UAE is more robust on this issue, perhaps the Saudis too, but others aren't. The Qataris aren't, the Bahrainis aren't, the Kuwaitis aren't. So there's a division amongst the Gulf states about exactly what to do. And they're kind of all looking at this American force heading, this beefed up force, Trump's Navy heading towards the Gulf, and wondering, like all of us, what exactly will they do when they get there? Because one of the other things I've learned, and gosh, we are learning a lot every day, aren't we? All becoming sort of amateur armchair generals and armchair petroleum exporters and tanker operators. Apparently, on Kharg Island, which Trump has been obsessed with since the 1980s, they have the way that they fill up their tankers for export is in such a way that if the tankers have to break loose very quickly because there's an incoming attack, they can. So they're not tethered in the same way that they were. And the other thing is that there's like 4 or 5 other islands that also have oil loading capacities, and they've all been beefed up. So if you're an expeditionary force, launched by Donald Trump heading into the Gulf, it's not just Kharg Island you may have to consider, but all these other little islands. I mean, it's geographically complicated.
Absolutely. Well, you're not going to get to Kharg Island until you've got through the strait.
Exactly.
If it's a landing force, I mean, yes, you could attempt airborne assault, but if it's a landing force coming from ships, you have first got to get through the strait.
Just on the money, just quickly. So if you're a tanker company and you're now having to pay, up to $2 million for each ship to get through for the passage, does it make financial sense to do so? Because that's about a tenth of the value of the tanker.
Yes.
But I guess it makes sense because the oil that you carry is maybe worth 150 million, 160 million. So it's still, the business model still works.
Yes. And some of the more, shall we say, sporty tanker operators have been taking the risk. I mean, they've been coming out in 1s and 2s, Greek flagged, some other nations, Southeast Asian nations. They have been getting some out, whether it's through an informal arrangement with the Iranians. But clearly, my suspicion is the Iranians would like to step this up. Apparently, there's a bill going to the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, to sort of regularize the toll idea and put it into law, into Iranian law. And that's the reality they'd like to create when this is over.
Wouldn't that be ironic if, after all this, sacrifice of blood and treasure, all the billions that have been spent on this war, we end up with a bloke still called Khamenei who's running the country, but we end up with Iran more resilient, able to do quite a lot with very little. I know they've been militarily weakened, but, at the moment they seem to have the upper hand, and they've used the Strait of Hormuz. They've leveraged that in a way that actually, many military planners had imagined, but actually seeing it happen is another thing, isn't it?
And we remember the circumstances under which the Armada, in inverted commas, set out from the eastern seaboard of the United States when demonstrators were being killed on the streets. It was, we won't let this happen, but actually the forces weren't in place. The forces then were in place. The war has happened, and the outcome may end up strengthening the regime by giving it that additional income and securing its exports and its control over the strait in the longer term.
Do you think that we're being too pessimistic here, that actually maybe in 2 weeks' time, if and when the Iranians have run out of missiles and drones, it is just game over? Or if Trump were to hit their power plants, I know there's a massive risk of escalation there, and that's one reason why he called it off. But if you hit their power plants, then there's only so much they can do. Are we giving them too much benefit here for their resilience?
One thing you could argue is that they are also sensitive to both the oil price and the implications of completely closing the strait, including with their allies in China, who get so much of their oil from there, that they are sensitive to that, which is why they're operating this system and allowing some out and allowing... Now, if they are sensitive to that, that does indicate potential pressure points or points of weakness. Kharg Island, obviously, Trump's favourite option or whatever. But I think there are still some escalatory possibilities that the US and Israel might use that we don't really know whether Iran has obviously threatened to respond against industry, against power plants, desalination, and we've seen them trying to do some of it. But the real question, I think, with some of those retaliatory options is what is their ability to actually, turn the lights off in Israel, for example? And we're not quite so sure about that. The odd thing we've learned so far in this war is that their short-range missiles and drones are much more accurate, and therefore they can.
Which is why the Gulf states have been so badly affected.
And they can turn the lights off in some of the Gulf countries, but we don't really know. And of course, it's Israel that would be hitting some of these things like power plants, or the Americans, to be fair. But we know the Israelis have hit their steel plants recently.
Yes, which apparently I didn't know this, but the Iranian steel is a massive industry. It's another great
second biggest.
Industry. Exactly. Yeah.
But to your question, I think we cannot assume that all of the escalatory options would leave them untroubled. That there might be worries on their side about what's actually going to be left of this economy when we do the deal we'd like to do. And so, yes, we shouldn't necessarily assume that they hold all the cards.
But we're having a very different conversation to the one that we might have had a month ago had the war gone differently, and certainly a different conversation to the one that the Pentagon and the White House assume that we'd all be having at this stage. So let me ask you about another indicator, the troops on the way.
Yes.
Who's coming and what will they do?
So maybe we'll do that next week. But I would say we're not there yet. So, 2,500 Marines. Let's remember 2003 invasion of Iraq, 130,000 boots on the ground, as well as all the other people on warships and Air Force and all the rest of it. So the numbers are very, very small. And the kind of force...
Are they show and tell, do you think? I mean, is this to kind of encourage the Iranians to come to some conclusion? Or
it gives you options. Yeah. So if you were to say to me, OK, let's stop the flow of oil from Kharg Island, but without taking it or bombing it, your option is to board tankers. And the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, for example, that's one of the things they train to do is board ships. They have helicopters, So it gives you that option.
Right.
It does give you the option to go in, maybe do a raid somewhere near the Strait of Hormuz to clear out a missile site, something like that. But it doesn't give you the option to take and hold significant amounts of ground. It's just not enough.
Because I guess the big choice facing Trump, and therefore all of us, is if you don't accept that you have to do a deal with the regime that you swore to get rid of just a month ago, that, whose supreme leader you bombed on day one. And the Israelis, of course, still believe, and we'll talk about that in a minute, they still believe deeply in regime change. But if you don't want that, you don't want to do a deal with the devil, then it has to be the other thing. It has to be a ground invasion, doesn't it? Really? I mean, that's where this tanker is heading.
But
because if you can't do a deal, and if you don't want to do a deal, and Trump may want to do a deal, but the Israelis may not let him at the end of the day.
I don't think they carry on bombing without the Americans. Or if they do, it's for a very limited and demonstrative period. Just as I think it's been fairly clear since early on in this, that if the Americans stop, the Iranians will performatively say, we're not stopping, we're not ready. They want to show that Trump is the demandeur and that they are the ones dictating terms. So it's possible the Israelis might do something similar, but I don't think they carry on in any significant way without Trump. Because otherwise, all sorts of things could happen negatively for them, and Trump will want to bring it to a halt. But I think he's already signalled in a way, and in a minute you must tell me, your reading of his domestic political position, but I think he's already signalled that he's ready to do a deal with these guys. He's just said, we just don't know who to talk to.
What he's saying, of course, officially is that they're begging to do a deal with him, whereas actually all the signals indicate that he's trying to do a deal with them. So there are the domestic indicators.
Yeah, what's your key thing
so
you're looking
my
at?
domestic indicators don't look good for Trump. And it's not just the opinion polls where you see a flagging support for the war. There was never a majority in favor, unlike there was with Iraq in 2003. There was never a majority of the American public that was in favor. Even though America, oddly, ironically, is energy independent, is the biggest energy exporter in the world, people are feeling the pain at the pump. Even more than here. I mean, you go to places like California where there are lots of surcharges anyway. The price of diesel and petrol has gone up exponentially, and of course, all these alternative fuels that you put in your car, there's biofuels. They've also gone up because there's scarcity all around because of shipping and because of the strait being sort of semi-closed. So that's bad news on the opinion poll front for Trump.
Can I add in one other indicator that we're looking at, which is, of course, markets?
Yeah.
Now,
Yes.
we've seen this pattern of making certain announcements on Friday afternoon after the markets are closed, like the threat against infrastructure that was made a couple of weeks ago. And then, the nervous wait for the futures market to open on Sunday evening. He does listen to markets, though.
He does.
Yeah.
But the trouble is the markets are no longer listening to him. So he says something, and if he says it 3 times and the reality doesn't correspond to what he's been saying, so a rosy statement about this war is winding down, but I'm still sending thousands of troops in that direction, and they're still firing their drones and their missiles. So the reality doesn't match with the words. And if you look at what markets have been, so let's say go back to last Monday, right? So last Monday morning, just before the markets opened, Trump made this statement about postponing the doomsday deadline by another 5 days and so on. The doomsday clock. The markets yelped with joy.
Some people made a lot of money.
Yeah, some people, that's another subject. So the markets basically reacted. They yelped. Things that were supposed to go down went down, and things that went up went up. And then ever since then, he's tried the same gambit. When things looked a bit wobbly, he's come out with these positive statements, and the markets have barely budged. And what that tells me, and what my friends who work in finance tell me, is that the markets are nervous. They're sitting on the fence. They're not quite sure how to read this. So they haven't panicked, because panic would mean oil at $160 a barrel, which
Absolutely.
it isn't, or more. Unsustainable. But they haven't done that, but nor have they gone down to 90 or 80. They're just sitting on the sidelines, a bit like all of us, because they're not entirely sure what Trump will do. And they don't believe everything that comes out of his mouth. And that's a tricky situation to be in, right? If you're trying to manage the messaging of this war, then I think that's really hard. So we touched on it briefly, J.D. Vance possibly going to Pakistan, Pakistan's role as a mediator in all this, which I think the White House has confirmed. But what do we actually know about this, and who's talking to whom?
Gosh, this is so hard. We saw this in the run-up to the abortive talks in Oman, both this year in February and last year before the June war. Questions about where is this, who's doing this, where is it happening? Now, in both cases, it ended up settling in Oman. But for example, this year, at one point, it was supposed to happen in Turkey, and Turkey was very much trying to put themselves in as the mediators. So now, I would say, they're the ones to watch. Notwithstanding that Pakistan has made these statements and said, we'd be willing to host and all that kind of stuff, the Turks are definitely very active in this, in trying to negotiate something. And we've seen the multilateral alignment of Turkish, Pakistani, Egyptian, Saudi foreign ministers all trying to concert a line or work out something that might appeal to both sides to get them around the table. But definitely the Turks and the Pakistanis are in there. The Omanis, of course, having played host to talks that disastrously miscarried, would like to be in there. I mean, they've made a lot of negative comments about the Israelis and the Americans, trying to sort of, in a sense, stay on side with the Iranians. But the Iranians have been bombing them and bombing their ports and facilities. So I think the Omanis are out of the picture for the time being.
I spoke to a senior Qatari government official last week. The Qataris, of course, are great negotiators, and they've been negotiating in all sorts of conflicts, including in Venezuela, with kidnappings back in the day, not recently, and of course, famously with Hamas and Israel. They're not interested. I mean, they're so upset by what's happened, understandably, because their natural gas, oil, production and export facilities have been bombed to smithereens, and they're going to take many, many years to recover from that. So they're not interested anymore. And I also think, getting back to the Pakistanis, it was so interesting that a lot of the ships that managed to slip through the strait, either because they paid money or because they were allowed to go through by the Iranians, were Pakistani flagged. So there was a lot of flag exchanging that went on. And maybe the Pakistanis, they've got a special place in all this, and they're trying to cash in on this, both financially, but also diplomatically. But I don't know where this will lead, frankly. And I just don't know also to what extent anything that is said by the American side in these negotiations will be believed by the other side, considering that the Iranians rightly say, well, twice we've talked to each other and we thought things were going quite well, and then he started bombing us.
Yeah. I think this point, I mean, the shattered sense of security among the Gulf leaders is obviously one of the key things that will come out of this. And I think this point about just how far do you go now with Trump entrusting him? I mean, clearly, some of these Gulf leaders, particularly the Qataris, Saudis, and UAE, after that business last summer when the Israelis tried to kill the Hamas leadership in Qatar, they very effectively put pressure together on Trump. And they thought they had a deal. And in fact, of course, you may recall that Qatar and the US signed this security agreement with guarantees. It may have been the same Qatari. I spoke to one after this and said, well, guys, you've done it. You've got a deal that's better than Israel here. And he replied, it's all dependent on the whim of one man. So it doesn't really amount to much, which I think was prophetic under the circumstances. So they've got to make decisions. And I think, the question, one of the tankers that's supposed to be coming out today is carrying Saudi oil. So the question for all of them now as to how far do they actually keep channels open with the Iranians through the Pakistan, try and find their own new regional balance here. None of them have entered the war on the side of the US and Israel. I think all of them think that would be toxic in terms of domestic opinion. But do they still count on the Americans when this is over? Do they seek new arrangements? Do they appease Iran? A lot of them would say they'd already tried doing that. And look how that ended. So they're between a rock and a hard place.
Here's an interesting sidebar. So you remember the run-up to the Gaza ceasefire, the one that actually worked out?
Yes.
So the thing that got Trump to basically put his foot down and force Benjamin Netanyahu, who was in the Oval Office, it happened, I think, last September, just after the UN General Assembly meeting in New York. Basically, the Israelis bombed the Hamas headquarters in Qatar. The Qataris were furious with the Israelis. Qatar had just promised, apparently Donald Trump his shiny new plane once he leaves office. They'd signed that security agreement. And here are the Israelis bombing the Hamas headquarters in Qatar, which was then still leading negotiations between the two sides. So there's that famous picture which the White House made certain that we would see. It's a stills photograph.
Of Bibi apologizing.
But also Trump hands him the phone and says, call them up, call up the Emir of Qatar and apologize. And that then led to ultimately, down the road, we had the ceasefire. The fact that Trump was able to, put Benjamin Netanyahu on notice like this and put him in line, basically, read him the riot act, was fascinating. And I just wonder whether he's still doing that. I mean, apparently he did it after the attack on the Iranian, oil and gas installations, which then led to the attack on the Qatari gas field and the gas production facility.
The Pars gas field.
At Ras Laffan. I mean, this was such a big blow to Qatar. But again, Qatar gets it in the neck all the time, doesn't it? Either from the Iranians or from the Israelis. And the reason I'm saying all this is I just don't get the impression that Trump is in control of much of the stuff that he thinks he's in control of, including his own messaging. And I think this thing is, if you look at the last 4 weeks, it's spun out of control because they underestimated Iran's resilience, they underestimated, Israel's determination, and they underestimated the importance of the oil markets.
Yeah. And the fact that, in a sense, the biggest miscalculation was they failed to appreciate that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was in certain ways a moderating influence. Faced with the situation after last June's war of do we just batten down, do a deal, accept that, they might possibly do this to us again, he guided the Iranian leadership towards saying, yes, better that than endless escalation, which might do untold damage to the country. So by removing him, they have removed a potentially moderating influence in this discussion.
And I wonder, Mark, if that goes back to Trump's own personal obsession with leadership and, the big man at the top of the tree. Because this is a man who's shown us not just in recent months, but actually, while he's been in office, also the first time round, that he believes in decapitation of leadership as a strategy of war. So, or certainly a strategy of victory. So he got rid of Maduro, he got him kidnapped, Did that change the regime in Venezuela? Not one bit. He may think the same will happen in Cuba. I don't think it necessarily changes the Cuban setup. He respects exceptional people at the top, whether they're goodies or baddies. So, I wonder if that is a rabbit hole that he's gone down. He kills Khamenei, he gets another Khamenei. There's no guarantee that Khamenei Jr., the Nepo Ayatollah, would have taken over from Khamenei Sr. if this assassination hadn't happened. So what are you being told? What are your indicators of what's going on right now?
Well, I think anyone who tells you with any confidence that they know what's going on is probably lying. I mean, the Israelis, we know from their ability to pinpoint these people when they're going to particular meetings, clearly have extremely good visibility inside the regime. They know all kinds of things about the regime's positions. And we have to consider that. We have to consider, well, how can they be so good at X, Y, and Z when it comes targeting to them, but so mistaken in their judgments about certain other things? For example, escalating against the gas field. Now, I think probably there's a middle ground there where they have reasons for doing some of those things they do that seem to us to be sort of pointlessly escalatory. Clearly, they hope through escalation to cause a more sober mood to overtake what is left of the leadership. But yes, I mean, you've got the Speaker of the Parliament, you've got the Commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, you've got a few key figures like that, the people in the Supreme Leader's office, if you like, the gatekeepers. If he's still seriously injured and not really able to exert power, they might be exerting power in his name. But this is going to be a key thing. And it was even said, I think it was J.D. Vance himself who said it before this started, we don't really know who to talk to.
Well, Trump has said it too.
Even more so now.
We were going to talk to, now there's no one left.
Even before they'd started this, they were saying that. And that, I think, is going to be an absolutely critical hurdle in trying to bring this to a halt. I
mean, the other thing, of course, that we keep talking about, and again, we don't really know, unless you do, Mark, the 440 kilograms of enriched uranium. Do we know where they are?
Not you and I, but the US intelligence community.
They do?
There was a very curious statement.
They haven't told you?
A couple of weeks ago, there was a very curious statement in front of the House by Tulsi Gabbard, where she said, we know with high confidence where all of it is. Now, under the rules, the laws that govern these testimonies, if she says high confidence, that means multiple sources of intelligence. So, yes, maybe the Israelis have got a spy who tells them, and maybe they, through observing overhead through satellites or intercepting emails, have collateral on that. Now, the inference, I think, and I wrote this in the Sunday Times, from what people are saying, is that it is all underground at the Isfahan facility.
Right.
One of the places where they caved in the entrances with bombs. So on the one hand, you might say that a lot of those theories that were going around during the 12-day war, they'll have scattered it into penny packets all over the country, was not true. And that in a sense, if you wanted to try and go in and get it, the key thing, the intelligence about where it is, if you believe Tulsi Gabbard, is actually pretty precise and reliable. But the question of how on earth would you surround that Isfahan facility with enough troops to fight off the people who'd be trying to stop you while you dug in through those collapsed tunnels and tried to find these containers? I mean, an extraordinarily complex operation that would be. I mean, I've spoken to some people, both Israeli and on this side of the Atlantic, who've been in the special operations world, who've suggested it's possible. But boy, oh boy.
But what a risk, eh?
Yeah,
I mean, remember
under
Jimmy, the thing that really did for Jimmy Carter was that
Eagle
failed
Claw,
mission to rescue the hostages, which arguably is a much easier thing to do than trying to dig up 440 kilograms of enriched uranium hidden, entombed in a mountain somewhere, near Isfahan. And are you getting the same that I'm getting, which is that if they had had that uranium and carried on enriching it a little bit further, they would have been 2 weeks away.
2 weeks,
2 weeks from making a nuclear device.
I think even the IAEA, the international watchdog, has said that the amount of time you need to convert some of it to up to the north of 90% for fissile material, in other words, to use in an atomic bomb, was a couple of weeks.
But if removing the nuclear capability of the regime as well as the regime itself was one of the original reasons for going to war, unless they actually capture this stuff and get hold of it, I'm talking about the Americans, then we're kind of back to square one, aren't we?
Possibly, but even if they do capture it, there's nothing to stop the Iranians building new centrifuges and making more. I just think the level of intelligence penetration of the regime is such that the Israelis and therefore the Americans would soon become aware of that. But did they say disarming it of nuclear weapons or ending the nuclear program, for example, which is always the thing that the Iranians have clung on to, their right to have nuclear power and their own enrichment? I'm not sure they did, particularly in the way the Pentagon formulated the military aims, which was to prevent Iran being a threat to its neighbours. Now, lordy lord, I mean, we're a month in and they're still firing off enough drones and missiles to be a threat to them. So they have failed by that yardstick. But on the nuclear, so far, but on the nuclear side, I think they left themselves room for manoeuvre.
I think what is consistently underestimated by the Americans, and I wonder if this is a side product of the sophistication of their smart weapons, is that firepower determines wars. And what they're not looking at is all the other, more mystical stuff, like the power of resilience, of mythology, of history,
national
of character.
will.
What does it do if you are the junior Khamenei and your dad's been killed, your wife's been killed, your son's been killed, your wife's been killed? You are going to be really upset, and you will do whatever you can, however injured you might be, if you're still functioning, to do as much damage as you possibly can to the Americans. And that applies to everyone else. And it applies to all the institutions. And I think one thing that is so difficult for us to get a handle on is to what extent that other element of Iran, the people on the streets that we saw in January that were massacred, the Iranian exiles that I know, some of whom are good friends that I speak to in this country and in America, who are so determined for regime change to continue as a primary goal of this war. What proportion of the population do they represent? What about, we know about the hardcore supporters of the Revolutionary Guard.
Well,
but what about the people in the middle?
Last elections would suggest there's 10 million of them.
Yes.
I mean, there's quite a lot in
There
a
is a
nation
lot
of
of
92 million. Yeah.
And what about the people in the middle who don't like the Ayatollahs but aren't prepared to die on the streets? Do they now think this is the Battle of Karbala 680 AD all over again? By the way, mythology, this is another one of my final indicator. Mythology in Iran is incredibly important. So the Battle of Karbala, as you know, where the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Ali, was defeated by the Umayyad Caliphate, Yazid I, I think he was called. It's a little bit like Masada in Israel, or like the Battle of Kosovo Field, or a little bit like Dunkirk. It is a heroic defeat. And this heroic defeat, where a nation is able to be resilient and survive against, overwhelming odds, which is such a powerful force, in the story that you tell yourself in the middle of a war, or indeed outside a war. This is very important because Karbala has been popping up left, right, and center, in propaganda and in what the messaging of the government. Now, many of the people will say, especially those demonstrating, nonsense, right? Nonsense. But for others, this will be a motivating factor. And again, something that we have to look up and we have to get wise about. Do you think militarily and politically, and I'll give you my own opinion, this could be another Vietnam for the Americans?
I think there's two aspects to this. The first is that it's always been an existential fight for the Iranian regime, but a war of choice for Trump, and somewhere between the two Netanyahu would portray it as an existential struggle. But I think for most Israelis, knowing that the war-filled recent past of their country, I'm not sure they expect it to produce a definitive answer to the Iranian threat. So I think they're somewhere in between the two. Now, clearly, if it's an existential threat, as it is for the Islamic regime, they will go to levels and go to an extent that clearly the Americans won't. Trump, whatever he's going to do, he's not going to mobilize the population of the United States to send hundreds of thousands of troops there, like the 91 Gulf War, 500,000 ground troops to go and take then only the south of the country. That's not going to happen. The one aspect where I think, and my last indicator, there is the potential for a Vietnam-style
mission creep.
Well, no, I would say complete disillusionment of the Americans is the degree to which their military may be shown to have been not up to the task, and that new forms of warfare, so-called asymmetric, as indeed the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese practice against them, may, in a sense, humble them. Now, we've seen just over the weekend how some key aircraft were damaged at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. Now, okay, so what? A couple of tankers and one of these spy planes, electronic early warning radar station, flying radar station. Very expensive, embarrassing. But the point is, a couple of weeks ago, 3 other tankers were hit there. So the American military has not been able to think about that, disperse the planes, create the right sort of earthworks to protect them, that kind of thing. American helicopter destroyed on the ground outside Baghdad by one of these first-person view drones that we've seen used so extensively in Ukraine. That kind of thing. I think the American military is going to learn some very hard lessons, particularly if they put ground troops ashore.
And isn't the story here always that America tries to do war on the expensive war, but on the cheap when it comes to losing American lives? So we can do this in a weekend. We can do it in a week. Again, you're relying on the smartness of your weapons when you're not making very smart political or strategic decisions, right? And I think that's a big problem here, because not only are these weapons not able to take everything out, but the language with which they're sold, or their ability is sold from the podium by the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, is so bombastic and so over the top. It raises expectations that you can't possibly meet. And then you're back to that old question, the original sin of this war. What were the reasons for doing it?
Yeah.
And if it wasn't existential, which it wasn't for America, and it wasn't even a war of necessity, which it may have become in terms of oil, but nothing else, then why on earth did we do it in the first place? Okay, finally, Britain. What's Britain's role in all this, if any?
Hiding behind the sofa. That is basically Britain's role. Look,
are we doing a good job of that? I mean, you can just see the head peek up above the sofa too.
All sorts of things have happened, haven't they? Obviously, politically, for Keir Starmer and his government, it's toxic to be too close to Trump and Netanyahu on this. So they don't want that. And
Has he steered a good line on this?
And the polls suggest, that the public basically are supportive of that. You can take a more geopolitical line and say, hang on a minute, you told us to focus on Europe. That's what we're trying to do with our defence and everything else. They're not spending enough money on it. But anyway, so there are lots of reasons for saying we don't want to get too involved. And now, even though the UK is saying, well, we get involved in mine clearing, the small print is only after the guns fall silent, effectively.
Right, which is something that Trump keeps pointing out. Right,
not against opposition. We don't have the ability. We've had some difficulty sending a single large warship to the area, and possibly a submarine that is lurking there. So I think from the UK point of view, no, they want to stay well clear. But I would say that a lot of those points about warfare and lessons, what if Iran mounted a sort of Operation Spider's Web? That was the Ukrainian attack on those Russian bomber bases deep inside Russia at RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. It would take time to organise, so hopefully it won't happen. But the implications then for Britain, our sense of national security, our ability to protect our own forces and US forces here, could all be shown up. So there's some quite big risks, I think, even having taken the position that Starmer has.
And we haven't even talked about Diego Garcia and missiles flying towards that, and the range that shows. And maybe next time we can talk about how the cost of this war. A Shahid drone is about $30,000 a pop. The Iranian, the Ukrainian interceptor drone, to get rid of it, maybe $3,000.
Cheapest.
What's the market rate for a Tomahawk missile these days, or for a Patriot missile?
Well, they're both about the same, actually, 3 to 4 million. But you don't shoot. You don't shoot a Shahid down with.
No. Of course you don't. But still, there've been more.
Plus, if the Shahid hits your oil plant, so you can justify spending quite a lot to bring it down, if you're preventing hundreds of millions in damage. But those are the difficult equations for people. It's been the daily struggle of the Ukrainian air defense forces for the past 4 years. That matching of means to ends, and how you're going to bring them down. But generally, they bring the drones down through electronic warfare, guns, other things that don't cost much.
That's it for this episode of Fourcast Indicators on the Iran war. Many thanks to Mark Urban, and thanks to you for listening. See you soon.